had imagined. It wasn't just one big step, but it was still thrilling.
You were actually working as a U.S. attorney while you were writing Presumed Innocent, correct?
I had never renounced my ambition to be a novelist. And, I had promised myself that somehow I was going to still have the time to write fiction, which turned out to be on the morning commuter train. It was really the only time I had. And but I would write, bearing in mind what Wally Stegner and Dick Scowcroft had taught me. 30 minutes a day on the morning commuter train, I would write longhand at first, in spiral notebooks. And, I think there were some books left over, frankly, notebooks left over from my days in law school. As I've been continued to be a dreamy student and hadn't really taken notes. So, but as I began to think about being a novelist and being a lawyer, I started to learn some really, really good lessons. And while I was at Stanford, there were a lot of highfalutin debates about literary theory and what's the goal of fiction and what makes great work. And the two competing visions were sort of the Tolstoyan one. On one hand, there's the avant-gardists who think that art leads culture, and therefore the greatest art is the art it's almost like technology. It's the new thing. Then there was the Tolstoyan view. Let me go back one more step. The avant-gardists said, and Ezra Pound being the best example of the attitude that always struck me funny, which was, the artist is the antenna of the race, and thus he will never be understood by the bullet-headed many. So this presupposes that art is an elite exercise. And it just, the greatest art can't be understood by most people. Then there's Tolstoy, who says the idea that, that great art can't be understood by most people is like saying that, great food tastes bad to almost everyone. He just dismissed that out of hand. And it went without saying that as an artist, I like the poems of Ezra Pound, but Tolstoy's, number one for me. But how to write a book that could be understood by the many was not as obvious to me. And I remember sitting in a courtroom trying to figure this out, as I did almost every day, and of course attending to my duties as a lawyer. And I was watching two younger lawyers do their stuff in another story, since I end up remembering everything. But case ended up going all the way to the US Supreme Court because of a jury instruction. But I'm sitting there watching, and I'm looking around, and what was the case about? Stolen food stamps. The name was Liparata, of the defendant. And yet, it's a piddling crime, right? But everybody in the courtroom is just spellbound when the star witness got on the stage and, talked about how Frank Liparata had hatched this plot, to steal and cash food stamps. And I thought, wow, look at this. Here's a universal subject, crime. Everybody's fascinated by crime. And even if it's not everybody, I'm fascinated by crime. What had drawn me most during those years at Stanford, when I was saying, gosh, what these lawyers do is fascinating. What had drawn me most were my friends who had become prosecutors, or in a couple of cases, defense lawyers. I didn't care which side they were on, but just that clash about, how you define good versus evil, uh, and, how do you cabin the power of the state so that they're not just imprisoning people willy-nilly. Uh, that just all spoke to me. And so, when I got a chance while I was a law student at Harvard, because the law school campus was a little hostile, I went off to the Boston DA's office and worked there as a clerk, and eventually was allowed to try a couple of very, very minor cases, one involving a guy who owned too many dogs and didn't have a kennel permit. So, but I loved it. I loved it. I loved the criminal law, and in that courtroom, watching Liparata, which, as I say, how ironic! The only case I was involved in I guess 35 years was that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, was this sort of rum-dum food stamps case. And I had I had told the two young women who were working for me, "Oh no, he's given the wrong jury instruction. We're going to have trouble with that." And I was right. It went all the way to the Supreme Court on that basis. But aside from recognizing the jury instruction was a problem, I just realized this is it. This is the heartland, and I really committed myself then to writing a novel that I had already started, which was based loosely on my experiences in the Suffolk County, the Boston DA's office.
Readers got to know Kindle County really well in Presumed Innocent and in many books that followed. Is that actually based on a place you lived in or worked in before?
I was writing, I thought about Boston, but I was working feverishly as an AUSA. It's a wonderful job, but it's not an easy lift. So I was working truly, 60 to 70 hours a week. And I never have really kept a diary or a journal. Everything that's really that leaps out to me as having emotional significance, I end up plucking and putting into the novel. So I'm writing about Boston, but as the years went on, the place I was writing about began to resemble Chicago more and more. And eventually I faced the fact, well, this isn't Chicago and this isn't Boston. So, it's a smaller Midwestern city, more like the size of Milwaukee than Chicago. But it's not Milwaukee either. So I just have to give it another name. And somehow Kindle County came up. There is a Kendall County in the far outskirts of the Chicago metropolitan area. So that probably was, was working under the surface. But I was writing, I thought about Boston, but I was working feverishly as an AUSA. It's a wonderful job, but it's not an easy lift. So I was working truly, 60 to 70 hours a week. And I never have really kept a diary or a journal. Everything that's really that leaps out to me as having emotional significance, I end up plucking and putting into the novel. So I'm writing about Boston, but as the years went on, the place I was writing about began to resemble Chicago more and more. And eventually I faced the fact, well, this isn't Chicago and this isn't Boston. So, it's a smaller Midwestern city, more like the size of Milwaukee than Chicago. But it's not Milwaukee either. So I just have to give it another name. And somehow Kindle County came up. There is a Kendall County in the far outskirts of the Chicago metropolitan area. So that probably was, was working under the surface, but I just.
No, it's great. Go ahead. I apologize.
No, somehow it was Kindle County, and I've been spending time with friends in Minneapolis, and I was impressed that, like Hennepin County was in some ways the more important governmental unit, that there were places in the US where county level governance mattered, particularly when there was more than one more than one municipality. So, and I just decided, okay, it's Kindle County. There are 3 cities there, 3 small cities, and Kindle County is really the umbrella over all of them. And the license, of course, to invent a whole new landscape and a whole new history was and has been wonderful over the years.
America first fell in love with attorneys, Rusty Sabich and Sandy Stern, and the book and blockbuster film that followed. Take fans back to the first time those 2 characters knocked on the door to your muse.
They all had attributes of people I knew, but most often, something from this person, something from that person. Rusty has a more direct antecedent. In the Suffolk County DA's office, the Boston DA's office, I had worked for and been supervised by a wonderful man, a terrific lawyer who, not shockingly, went on to great success as a trial lawyer in private practice, a guy named Tim O'Neill. And Tim fascinated me because he was a great prosecutor and tough in the way prosecutors have to be, but he was, Irish by birth, and he was also a poet. And he read his poems at times at a Cambridge bar called The Plough and the Stars. And I just got this idea, wow, what if I wrote a mystery novel, but instead of the sort of hard-boiled, diction of Raymond Chandler, which is in some ways, Hemingway-esque in the sense that it doesn't describe a lot of emotion. It's all implied. Instead of doing the hard-boiled version, what if it was more poetic? What if the voice sounded more literary? And that really was inspired by Tim. And Tim was in a difficult position in those years because Garrett Byrne, the very elderly district attorney in Boston, was dealing with an insurgent in his office named Newman Flanagan. And Flanagan was, kind of a born demagogue. And he'd prosecuted a Black obstetrician gynecologist named Kenneth Edelin, who died a couple of years ago. He'd prosecuted him for murder because he had performed a late-term abortion. It wasn't really any question what Edelin had done was legal, but of course, Newman Flanagan was smart enough to know that this was something that would attract support from the numerous very religious Catholics in the Boston area. And so he really stood on the throat, to use a familiar image these days, of a very fine physician in order to propel his own political career. And so that became the sort of emotional and in some ways factual backdrop of Presumed Innocent. And, Tim, who really was the person who should have run for DA if Garrett Byrne was going to step down, he was the guy who everybody in the office would have supported. Tim was too loyal to do that, to try to push the old man out of the way. And just as in Presumed Innocent, just as Nico DeLaGuardia wins the election, Newman Flanagan won the election and became the new DA. Described, writing on the morning commuter train, and I don't have any damn idea exactly where this book is going once I get beyond the Newman Flanagan stuff and, the idea of this very talented chief deputy in the office who's sort of cornered because he's too loyal to try to replace his boss. But eventually, the idea became he's investigating a murder, and lo and behold, he, the prosecutor, ends up accused of the murder. And, that seemed kind of daring. But once I accepted the fact that he was going to end up on trial, um, which ironically, that developed because my agent, this crusty old uh, lady, called me up and after 1L, and I'd been working as a AUSA for a couple of years. I told her what I was doing, and she interrupted. She says, wow, there's a trial in that book, isn't there? And frankly, because I was always too afraid of her to contradict her, I said yes. And that really was the birth of the idea that Rusty was going to get accused. So once he gets accused, of course, he has to have a defense lawyer. And I was a third of the way into the book, at least conceptually. And I'd never even thought of now, defense lawyer. This is a character who really appears, 40% of the way through the book, which is a weird time for a major character to suddenly drop into the scene. But that's exactly what happens with Sandy. And, I wanted him to be different. I didn't want him to be, the slick talking, criminal defense lawyer, in their cheap shoes and cheap suits and long hair that I would see in the courthouse. I wanted him to be, the very gentlemanly defense lawyers who were more of a rarity, but much, much more effective in federal court. And as a sort of idea of a gentleman, I'd always been fascinated by a friend of my parents who was a Cuban expat. And he was, to describe as Stern is described in one of the later books, he was kind of a dumpy looking little guy. But when this man began to speak, and he was not a lawyer, he just exuded charm. He became charismatic. And it was, as subsequently was said about Sandy, it was as if a beacon had lit up inside him. And so I exported this friend of my parents, figuratively speaking, to the courtroom, since I thought, well, that kind of guy could end up being a very effective lawyer. Because juries like people who are somewhat humble looking, so that, they don't feel they're looked down upon. They feel like they can identify with them. Sandy Stern, as a lawyer, is able to take advantage of everything that somebody else might perceive as a deficit.